Time to make the donuts. I made the donuts. I used to think that commercial was about getting up early in the morning to make donuts. Now I think it's about going through 100 different recipes to find a good donut recipe. And I have gone through one recipe after another. I have looked at probably hundreds of recipes on the internet, hundreds of pictures of donuts, and I finally found the right recipe. So I'm real excited to share this with all of you. And I found this on a blog called Hopefulthings. And Hope, if you ever see this video, I so appreciate you putting that recipe out there. And I'll put a link to her blog in the description box in case any of you want to make these by hand, because I mix these up in my bread machine. They turned out perfect. They're as close to a bakery donut as you'll ever get. I hate to even put the word homemade on this video because they are that good. They're light as a feather. They have the very light crispy coating and very tender insides. And one thing that I found with making all of the bad donuts was that I came to recognize what a bad donut looks like. If you want a good donut recipe, a donut needs to end up with a light band across the center like this. If they end up with a dark band, that's not a good recipe. What happens is the donut is too heavy and it'll sink down in the oil, and the oil will fry it up the side. Then when it's flipped, it's going to fry it up the side again, and you end up with a dark band of coloring around the center when it should float, be light and floating in that oil, and you end up with the light ring. If you look at pictures of donuts, you'll see what I mean. The bakery type ones will always have that light ring, and a whole lot of homemade ones out there don't. Believe me, that's a sign that they don't taste good either. And I know that a lot of people are concerned about making things healthy these days, but believe me, when it comes to donuts, if you want to have a donut that tastes like the donut should, then don't try to substitute the ingredients and make it healthy, because it's not going to turn out well for you, I don't think. There's shortening in the donuts, and they were fried in shortening. A lot of people don't want to tell you that they're frying them in shortening because of the whole trans fat issue. But the shortening now doesn't have trans fat in it. I use Crisco. There's no trans fat in there. In fact, it's half the saturated fat of butter. So I'm sure people will have some argument against it, but hey, you clicked on a donut video. What do you expect? So here's how I made the donuts. I used 1 1/4 cups of water, and I poured 1 cup of it into the bread pan, and I saved back 1/4 cup of water. This is warm water, by the way. Then I added 1/4 cup of shortening to the pan, and I stirred it up a little bit to try to melt some of that shortening. Then I added 1 1/4 tablespoons of yeast to the water that I saved back, and about 1/4 tablespoon of sugar. Then I stirred that up to get the yeast going. I like to mix my yeast separately when I'm using the bread machine to make sure that it's good and getting started. Then I added 1/3 cup of sugar, 1 egg that was well beaten, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla, 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg, and 3 1/4 cups of flour. This is store brand all-purpose flour, by the way. I tried the white lily flour in this and it didn't work out well. It was like the gluten wasn't strong enough to withstand the rising of the yeast, and they cracked open as they rose. Then I added the yeast mixture. Some of the recipes out there call for using bread flour. I tried that too, and you end up with a very tough, crusty exterior to the donut, and it doesn't work out well. I also tried using partial bread flour and partial all-purpose flour. That worked somewhat, but Believe me, just using all-purpose flour is what you need to do. I set the pan in the bread machine and set it on the dough cycle and let it run. As the dough is mixing, I'll check to make sure that it's the right consistency. You want it pulling away from the side of the pan. If it's too dry, add some more water. If it's too wet, add some more flour. I added a couple tablespoons more of flour. When the time was up, I took the dough out of the bread machine. Couldn't be easier. I put some flour on the counter. Then I had some baking pans that I had given a little spritz with a spray oil to the back side of the pan. And then I wiped that over good with a paper towel. I just wanted a very light coating of oil on it. And then I floured back to those pans. I'll be putting the donuts on these pans after I cut them out, and it's better to use the back side of the pan because after the donuts have risen, they're going to be so delicate that you want to handle them as little as possible. And if you can, you could scrape these off of the pan and into the oil. I ended up lifting them off with a little spatula and putting them in the oil that way. I poured the dough onto the floured counter. Then I punched it down and let it rest for 10 minutes. I rolled the dough out to about a ½ inch thickness, and then I cut out the donuts with donut cutters. I'm cutting some of these donuts out so that they'll be standard donuts with the hole in the middle, and I'm cutting some of them out without the donut cutter center in the cutter so that I can use them as filled donuts. The scrap of this dough pulled back together very nicely, and I was able to roll it out again and make even more donuts. Once all the donuts were cut out, I lightly covered them with some plastic wrap, and then I set them in my oven with the light turned on to let them rise. That gives them just enough heat to rise well. I let them rise for 30 minutes, and when the time was just about up, I mixed up my glaze. I used 2 cups of powdered sugar, ½ a tablespoon of cornstarch, ½ a teaspoon of vanilla, and a ¼ cup of water. Just mix it up thoroughly. Time to make the donuts. I heated the oil to 356 degrees because that's the setting on this fryer. A lot of recipes say to fry these things at 375. I found that is too hot. They fry too fast, getting too dark. 350 is a good number. And if you didn't listen and you substituted butter for the shortening, the smoke point of butter is 350 degrees. So if you fried those at 375, you can guess what's going to happen. Another problem with putting butter in the donuts is that the saturated fat count in butter is higher than the saturated fat count in whatever oil that you fry them in, whether it's canola or shortening or vegetable oil, and the donuts will be heavier and they'll sink. That's just my theory, because every picture I've seen of a donut that was made with butter has that dark ring around it that I was telling you about. The advantage of frying the donuts in shortening is that when the shortening comes to room temperature, it becomes a solid. If you use canola or vegetable oil or something like that, at room temperature, it is still a liquid. You can't drain all of that fat out of the donuts. Therefore, when they become room temperature, the oil will remain in that donut. It will be a liquid, and it will start soaking the crumb of the donut. They don't hold up very long, if they are fried in a liquid. These donuts fry rather quickly. I'd say less than a minute on each side. And then I drain them on paper towels. I've tried draining them on a cooling rack, but with a cookie sheet underneath it, and believe me, not one drop fell off of the donuts that way. You really want to put them on a paper towel so the paper towel can absorb some of the fat. While the donuts are still warm, dip them in the glaze. And that stove burner is not on. I'm not cooking that glaze. The donuts for filling are fried up the same way. And don't forget the donut holes. If you have a hard time turning these over, you can poke them in the top with the bamboo skewer and release some of the air in it, and they'll turn over easier. I mixed up some sugar and cinnamon in this jar, just shook it up, and then rolled the donut holes in that. So here's a piece of the donut, so you can see how soft these are. They're light as a feather. They're not hard and crunchy on the outside like all those others I tried. These are awesome donuts. So you'll know what a bad donut looks like. Here are some of the duds that I made. Notice the dark ring around the center where the donuts sunk down into the oil, and I fried these in vegetable oil. And that vegetable oil starts working against that glaze. Here's another batch of duds that I made, and another thing about these other recipes that I tried, they all had milk in them, and they all ended up with an awful taste. When you think about it, fried milk wouldn't taste very good. So, other recipes that I saw on a bakery type level, they used non-fat dry milk in them. This one doesn't have any milk in it. So, if you did want to add any milk, go with a non-fat dry powder. See what I mean about that dark ring? Don't use a recipe that ends up looking like that. It's not good. So that's how I made the donuts. This is an excellent recipe. And since this video is running so long, I'm going to do a separate one about how I made the jelly filling for the jelly donuts. And I hope to make another video about the cream-filled ones with the chocolate on the top. So it's time to make the donuts. I hope it helps.